Hello, and welcome to our third week of Faculty Perspectives. At this point in the summer, it's important that I remind you of the requirements for these sessions to stay on track to complete Introduction. In order to complete the basic requirements for introductions, students need to watch live or asynchronously 10 faculty perspectives of your choice and complete the reflection assignments on the community.uoregon.edu site for the entering class. Students who wish to earn 1 credit over the summer must select 20 faculty perspectives by first completing 2 full tracks of the faculty perspectives, 16 of those 20 total tracks required, or total talks, pardon me. Then select 4 additional faculty perspectives talks from any of the remaining tracks. Complete your post-talk reflections for all 20 of the selected talks, and then complete 1 comprehensive summary reflecting on your learning from the tracks you completed. You can find these details in the community.uoregon.edu course for the entering class. Also, as a reminder for you students watching live in Zoom today, we will have the last 15 minutes of this program dedicated to answering your live questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask your questions of our faculty here today. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our third presentation in the anti-racism track. Today, we're joined by Assistant Professor of Psychology, Camisha Russell, whose big question for today is, why is race so important to people using assisted reproductive technologies? Welcome, Dr. Russell.
Thank you. I'm actually in philosophy, not psychology.
Oh, I'm sorry,
so
philosophy. That's a typo on my part. My apologies.
You're fine. Just so no one's expecting any psychological data from me. Okay, so let's see. Is the PowerPoint up now?
It's all yours.
Okay. Oop, there we go. Why is race so important to people using assisted reproductive technologies? So you might already be confused by this question and what it has to do with what looks like a Gap ad. So let's break it down. What are assisted reproductive technologies? So here's the definition: the means that are used in non-coital, technically assisted reproduction where gametes are manipulated or embryos are created outside the body. But this definition might also be a little confusing. So what are we really talking about here? So these are 3 of the assisted reproductive technologies that I most often write about: in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination, and gestational surrogacy. And here are some definitions for those. So in vitro fertilization is when sperm and egg are brought together in a lab, resulting in an embryo implanted in a uterus. Artificial insemination is when donor sperm is used to achieve pregnancy without sex. And gestational surrogacy is when an embryo from IVF is implanted in a woman who will give birth to the child but will not raise it. That is a surrogate. So what do I mean when I say that race is so important? These are screenshots from sperm bank and egg bank websites where you can search for a donor whose sperm or egg you want to purchase. And what you can see here is that ethnicity or race is a part of the original sort of drop-down menu that allows you to begin searching for a donor. It's actually the first thing in both of them, unless on the one if you know the donor's actual name. And this is another website and article. Ohio woman sues sperm bank after birth of mixed race baby. Right, so this is clearly something that means a lot to people when they are seeking reproductive technologies. Okay, so our next part of our question is, what do I mean by race? Right? So that is a big one, and we will come back to it. Okay, so in today's Faculty Perspectives session, I'm going to answer these questions. Who am I? What is philosophy? What do philosophers do? Why do people care so much about race in reproductive technologies? And what is this race thing anyway? So here's me. I'm a relatively new faculty member at UO. This will be my 4th year, starting in September. My first book, the cover which is shown here, The Assisted Reproduction of Race, came out in 2018. And it was blurred by Angela Davis, which is the single most amazing moment of my life, next to the birth of my child, who you can also see there. I'm a mother of a 4.5-year-old, and he's helping me there take a photo for a virtual graduation. And I'm a philosopher. So when you think about philosophers, if you ever think about philosophers, you might picture this. That's Plato. There's Aristotle. There's Descartes. That's Kant. Locke, Hegel, Nietzsche, Sartre, Derrida, Foucault, and Rawls. In short, dead white guys, all white, all dead. But these are also philosophers. We have Desiree, so starting from left to right, we have Desiree Valentine, who's at Marquette University, Lindsay Stewart at the University of Memphis, Ronke Oke at the Westchester University, Shaida Mensah at Franklin and Marshall College. There's me, this is my dissertation defense, someone was kind enough to give me flowers. After that is Excel Carrera, who's at Emory University, Jamelia Shorter at Georgia College, and Aisha Abdullah, who went to medical school. And so are these. This is Angela Davis, a degree in philosophy, Anita Allen, Grace Lee Boggs, Kyle Poaz White, Uma Narayan, Rocio Zambrana, Charles Mills, and me again. So, if studying philosophy isn't just reading difficult texts by a bunch of dead white guys, what is it? So here's a definition, here's breaking the word apart, philosophia, love of wisdom. But that's not a very helpful answer if you're trying to choose a major or a career. So what is philosophy? Reading difficult texts by a bunch of dead white guys, that is a big part of the degree, I won't lie. Reading difficult texts by lots of different people, alive and dead. Asking questions about the world, life, and meaning. Answering those questions without relying on data, experiments, or field work. That's why I want to make clear I wasn't in psychology. And answering in terms of the history, relations, and coherence of ideas. So these are the things that we do in philosophy. And you can also think about philosophy as an academic language or discipline that you learn to speak by learning histories, concepts, methodologies, conventions, etc. So what do philosophers do? Let me switch that picture. What do philosophers do? So let's go back to our original question. Why is race so important to people using assisted reproductive technologies? So we can ask ourselves, how would a philosopher research this question? So in order to answer that question, I'm going to talk about how I came to the work that became my book. So what sparked this project on reproductive technologies and race? Well, I was getting ready in a hotel room one morning while at a feminist conference and a philosophy conference, and I saw a Good Morning America story about a US couple hiring a surrogate in India to carry their biological child. And then I also heard an NPR story once that was talking about embryos as property, and I was wondering if that was really the best way to think about them. So my first major obstacle in tackling this project came when I tried to articulate how I thought I wanted to write about these issues for my dissertation. So that's me, and there's the project on reproductive technologies, and then this is my advisor. He was pretty skeptical. But after our first demoralizing meeting, I went back the next day, and he apologized for his negativity, and he said that he trusted me. So, you know, sometimes you might have a conflict with a professor that you've been working with or something like that. You know, hang in there. You guys can work it out. You can be trusted. So how did I proceed? First, I read some books. That's what philosophers almost always do first. So I read this book, Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts, this book, Making Parents by Karis Thompson, and one essay from this book by Heidegger, Basic Writings. Then I took some classes outside of philosophy that related to reproduction and evolution and technology. And a year or so later, here's me, here's my evolving project, and here's my advisor. He was really excited, and he could see where I was going with the project. So, what are some of the arguments that actually ended up making it into my dissertation, which became my book? Why do people care so much about race in ARTs? Well, first of all, ART use makes visible the reproductive and family formation choices people have been making for a long time. Right, so people have been deciding who to marry and who to have children with for a long time, but we can see that very clearly when people are actually using drop-down menus on donor websites. Second, the idea that racial identity flows from parents to child is seen as perfectly natural, right? So you can sort of see that demonstrated in this picture, right? You know, all the sort of different, racially different families and their sort of racially matching children. Yet, laws and conventions about interracial sex, marriage, and reproduction have shaped American life since European settlement. So here you can see a picture of a protest against integration, where people believed that if there was integration in the South, there would be interracial sex and ultimately interracial marriage, which I suppose was all true. And then race has become an important marker of kinship, of relatedness, right? So if one does not racially match one's parents, right, there's an assumption of adoption, there's questions about kind of where did you come from, who are you? And therefore, race can be used to shore up kinship when ART use calls it into question. So when people are having children through ARTs, where they may not be genetically related to those children, they use things like racial similarity and difference to say who the proper parents of the child being produced will be. Also, when one is expecting a non-white child, expecting a white child, getting a non-white child can make white parents fear for that child's future. So this takes us back to that story about the Ohio woman who sued a sperm bank after the birth of her mixed-race baby. And in that suit, the woman was worried that the community where she lived was too white for a mixed-race child, and that her extended family was too racist. She said that she loves her daughter, but needs money from the lawsuit to best take care of her, since she's going to have a harder time than if the child were white. So many black parents around the world are awaiting their settlements for the burdens of raising black children. Anyway, so what is this race thing anyway? So this is where my research really helps out in my teaching. If I'm teaching a class like philosophy and race, which I will teach this coming spring, rather than just having my students learn about different theories people have had about race, I can actually put those theories in the context of my own theory so that they can see how philosophers work. So, one idea that we've seen a lot is that race is biological, but the science no longer supports this view. Another idea is that race is culturally and historically crucial for human well-being and progress. And we can actually see this view supported by white nationalists, right? This idea that the race of America, where that race is believed to be white, is what has caused American success, right? That the progress of Western civilization is down to the superiority of the white race. So that's another idea we've had historically about race. And then we have an idea that's popular in academia, which is that race is a social construction. Right? And so you can understand what we mean by race as a social construction in terms of an analogy to money. Right? So money is something that is socially constructed, right? We've made it up. It doesn't grow on trees. But it has come to have a lot of meaning, and now that once it's there and it has that meaning and these pieces of paper have the values that they have, the currency means something, we can't just change that anymore, right? We have to work within our the current values placed on money, and we have to sort of know how those values work and how to use money in this system. Right? So when we talk about race as a social construction, we're saying, yes, it's made up, but also it's real. We have to deal with it. We know the effects that it has, and we have to live in a world where we understand and work within those effects. And then here's my idea that I support in my work, that race is a technology. So what do I mean by that? So it means that race is socially constructed, right? I'm agreeing with that. It's something that people make. But I'm also highlighting the fact that the race idea is used to construct political and social realities. People use it to make and do things. Right? So they don't just create it for fun, but they actually use it for political purposes. So different people in different eras take up old race ideas for new purposes, some of which have to do with resistance to oppression and inequality. Right, so race may be made up by powerful people in certain instances to justify oppression, but later people may take up the idea of race to fight for justice or fight for equality. Right, so when we talk about Black Lives Matter, right, it's not that people are saying that blackness was not a made-up thing, but they are using that identity to talk about something that's important. So my overall argument in the book is that we should spend less time wondering if race is a real thing, what race is, and more time considering what it does. That is, we should think about how do people use this idea of race to distribute things like jobs or healthcare or money or social services, right? So how do people use, or how do people use ideas about race to gain political power, right? How do people running for office use coded terms to talk about race to inspire fear and gain votes, right? So my basic point is that we should think about race and what it does, and we should examine what it does in various times and places to better understand it, rather than just saying, is it real or not real? All right, so where can you go from here? In other words, while at the UO, how could you pursue research or engagement in this area or related to this research question? So this is a very interdisciplinary project, right? So I took classes outside of philosophy and worked with people outside of philosophy in order to undergo this project. So besides taking classes with me in the philosophy department, like medical ethics, which I'm teaching in the fall, or philosophy and race, which again I'm teaching in the spring, you could take classes in anthropology. There's Anth 162, Introduction to Medical Anthropology. There's Anth 278, Science, Race, and Society. Or you could take classes in political science. There's PS 206, Ethics, Identity, and Power. There's PS 319, The Politics of the Family. And you could take classes in sociology. There's Soc 345, Race and Ethnicity. You have Women and Gender Studies classes. There's WGS 221, Bodies and Power. WGS 331, Science, Technology, and Gender. So all those types of classes might lend to thinking about these kinds of interdisciplinary issues around race. Also, the Wayne Morris Center this year is currently in their second year of a 2-year program on, I think it's, I lost it in my notes. It's like science, society, and policy and society, I think. And this particular year, they're doing genetic technologies, identity, equality, and ethics. So they'll be doing programming that relates strongly to the kinds of stuff I talk about here. In philosophy, we have a thesis option for when you graduate, so you can, at the end of your time, do an honors thesis so that you can graduate with honors in philosophy. And that's the kind of thing that would allow you to think about a lot of different work you've done over the course of your 4 years and bring it together to answer a question like the question that I answered in my book. All right, now I will hand things to Cora to give me some questions.
Thank you so much. I am fascinated by this, and I'm going to start with a question of my own because I'm selfish that way. A couple years ago, the University of Oregon did a story about the ethics of medicine class, and hearing that you're teaching it coming up, I kind of want to take just a minute for you to talk a little bit about your approach to that. In my recollection, the story highlighted the fact that both philosophy students and students who are in human physiology and biology who are in a pre-med track are taking that class, and it really highlighted the depth of the conversation between the two disciplines. Can you talk about the way that you're going to approach teaching that class?
Yeah, my medical ethics class, because of the work that I do, focuses really strongly on inequality and what we can call social determinants of health, right? So these are things besides your biology or where you were, where you got infected with something, like things like that, right? That determine how well you do with your health. So it includes things like the neighborhood that you live in, the access that you have to fresh groceries, healthy food, pharmacies, that kind of thing. It can include the stress that people undergo as racial minorities in the U.S., right? That's been proven to have negative health effects. It can we've even learned epigenetically, right, that past trauma in your family can affect the expression of genes in your parents and therefore the expression of your own genes, right? So traumatic experiences that your parents or your grandparents have had can affect your health. It turns out that whether you have a lot of autonomy at work can affect your health, right? So whether you have a menial job where you're being ordered around a lot and you don't have much control, or whether you have a job that allows you to express your sort of creativity and freedom and autonomy. So So this is one of the things that I do cover in the class, and we spend a lot of time talking about, is how people's social positions, how their social identities can affect the kind of care they receive in the healthcare system, and just the overall mental and physical health that they manifest.
Awesome. And how does the discussion that you facilitate in that class, I mean, I assume still that several pre-med students are taking that course, and that you have philosophy students in that course as well. How does the facilitation that you do manifest itself during, like, between the two sort of right brain, left brain oriented majors that you might be having in your class?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. You probably would have to ask them, but but I think my hope is that for pre-med students that they are getting a sort of introduction to some of these factors which studies show are not always very well covered in medical school, right? So I'm hoping, I've got this moment, and I'm hoping that they can kind of understand that their patients are not just genes and organs, but are actually people with social histories that really impact, what's going on with them when they come to see a doctor, when they wind up in a hospital. For philosophers, I think maybe the discussion of the questions comes a little more naturally. They're a little more used to thinking about the effects of ideas on the world. But it's a nice concrete instance of that allows philosophy students to really think about some of the ideas that they've had in relation to a sort of concrete thing like healthcare and people's health.
Yeah, I would assume that the questions around the quality of life or the questions of life and death are, meaningful for both kinds of majors. And I'm sure it makes for a really interesting discussion in your course.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions from students, and so I want to make sure that we get to those too, and I don't hog the mic. Emily wants to know, how had the current political climate changed the way we view race? More people are becoming socially conscious about policies and government action. Isn't it the reflection that more people are becoming socially conscious about policies and government action isn't reflection that what does this tell us about the leaders who represent us?
Yeah, that's. I think for me that my work, sort of corresponds in interesting ways to the ideas that we have now, right? To really kind of this looking at what is the effect of being racialized as non-white in this country on your life, on on how the law sees you, on how people treat you, on how safe it is to walk down the street. So I think for me, yes, we see a lot in this current era, right? The use of race for political purposes. We see a lot how being racialized affects individual people. And so that's the kind of thing, the kind of broader thing that interests me. I've recently been asked to write a piece for Reproductive Biomedicine Online, which is a journal aimed at clinicians, at people who practice reproductive biomedicine. And the Black Lives Matter movement and the recent protests actually sparked that journal to ask me to talk about race with respect to reproductive biomedicine, and actually talk to two clinicians in this journal piece. So I'm working on that, kind of thinking about how lives matter in the context of reproductive biomedicine, which lives are being are being reproduced here and supported, and which lives are being reduced in value or assumed to have less value for prospective parents. So I'm excited to really take this conversation to clinicians and really use this moment to reach out to a group that might not have been as receptive before. As it happens, I wrote a piece that's way too long because I'm used to writing philosophy pieces, and this is a science piece, so I have to shorten it a lot. But hopefully that'll give me a chance to really talk to a different audience for me.
That's fantastic. Alex wants to know, if race is a technology, how do you see racism evolving as technology is ever changing? How do you believe that changes in our thought processes about reproduction can contribute to this evolution in racism?
Great, yeah. To think about race as a technology, I think also does suggest that we need to think about sort of our technological world and the kinds of things that that shape how we communicate, how we think. I think what we see both possibilities opening up as things change, and we see racism kind of reassert itself. So I think we often see both, both progressive moves and sort of reformulations that accomplish the same sorts of oppression, right? So, the way people thought about race when race science was being developed in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, especially up to the time of eugenics, when we think about the Nazi eugenics program, people didn't have the sort of idea of the genome that we have today, but they still had this idea that race was inherited and that it was a source of inferiority. Right, and so sometimes when we think about the genome, we see some interesting new developments, like I was mentioning before, epigenetics, where we can notice how how one's environment and the way one is treated actually affect the expressions of one's genes, right? So we can be sort of less determinist about how we think genes sort of make the person or make the person's life. But at the same time, we do find, a sort of reaffirmation of ideas of race in genetic language in a lot of what goes on today. So if you think about, 23andMe and other sort of home ancestry testing kits, right? What the reports that you get from them, right, focus on regions that we've associated traditionally with races. So you sort of see this like traditional 5 races appear in this, this test that might tell you that you are, 13% from Africa, or 25% from Asia, or that kind of thing. So we sort of see race popping up again, even within a sort of new scientific language that actually argues, for the most part, that the race that we've understood over time isn't real, right? So there's both progress and sort of regression, I think, always kind of happening at the same time.
Thank you. The students are asking just some excellent questions, and you've obviously sparked them in their thoughts. Emily wants to know, do you think environmental racism is taken seriously enough?
Yeah, no, definitely not. And I think we can see that right now, with the higher transmission and death rates of COVID-19 among minority populations. It does matter kind of where you live. And there's so many ways to think about environmental racism. I mean, there is kind of where you live, the level of pollution where you live. There's also, sort of if you live in crowded conditions, right, that's going to be bad for contagious diseases. What kind of, whether you have a home where your children, when they're not going to school, are trapped in a small apartment, or whether they have a yard to play in. There's a lot of different ways that health crises can impact your life, and how and where you're living can matter. So there's all kinds of things about toxins and pollution and things like that. But there's also just sort of living conditions, access to healthy things. There's whether or not you're an essential worker, right? So I think, there's no way that to take environmental racism too seriously, right? It's a huge factor in people's health outcomes for just a large variety of reasons that can all be linked back to the environment and to kind of where people are allowed or encouraged to live, and what care is taken with those spaces in which different people are living.
Well, and it seems that a lot of times it overlaps too with things like urban planning, and the way that zoning is done, and who lives where in proximity to things that pollute, right? And so there's so many interdisciplinary ways that a student can think about the things that you've talked about even today, and the topics that they're bringing up.
Yeah, and I mean, interdisciplinarity is just incredibly important for tackling racism, for anti-racist work, because there's just a lot of different factors that go on. There's individual psychology, there's sort of sociological trends, right? There's historical patterns, there's philosophical questions. I mean, all of these, there's public health issues. If you're not working interdisciplinarily, it's very hard to really tackle racism, because there are so many aspects that work together to maintain racist structures.
Thank you. Oscar wants to know, what do you think should be talked about more in academia about race in regards to your field?
Ooh, I mean, philosophy is an interesting one. It's right up there with the very hard sciences like physics in terms of representation of women and men and women of color, which is to say really low. So philosophy has a lot to answer for. Philosophers also historically are canonical philosophers. Some of the people that I showed in the PowerPoint presentation have been involved with sort of racist policy, with describing what race is, with assuming the inferiority of certain groups, the sort of non-applicability of sort of a broader humanism and universal rights to certain groups. So philosophy historically and contemporarily has a lot to answer for. But I do think there have been some interesting movements. I showed you that picture of my dissertation defense, right? And that was a university and some people in my department there at Penn State who had worked really hard to increase the number of students of color who were in the program, and that's why we were able to take such a great picture at the defense. University of Oregon's philosophy program is also doing that at the graduate level, especially. We're really working hard to recruit into graduate philosophy study people from a lot of different backgrounds. We have a lot of focus on feminism and issues of race and Latin American philosophy in our program. So that's good, and I think that's a benefit for undergrads. Who knows what it'll look like with Zoom, this coming term, but the philosophy club that the undergraduate students have run started a race-related reading group to read about philosophy and race. So I think there's some really interesting connections that graduate students and undergrads can make to kind of think about these issues and talk through them. And I'm really happy to have that conversation going on in our department here.
Thank you. Sophie wants to know, how do you think the medical field should change to promote anti-racism? It's a big question.
Oh my goodness, so many ways. No, I mean, I think it's, and doctors are scientists, that they're scientists by training, and I think, science sees things often very universally, that sort of there's just these kind of set of facts, biological facts, that you sort of need to know and master, and that's gonna kind of tell you what's going on with the patient. So I really, I'd like for people all across the medical field, including researchers and also practitioners, people who are seeing patients, to really, learn more about the way that these social determinants and these social positions affect their patients, and to sort of see their patients not as, this collection of biological factors, but actually as people who are embedded in a certain situation, who are living in certain communities and have certain priorities, and to really understand those things as being integral to treating those patients, not just kind of a side thing, but being integral. Also, there's a lot of ways in which medicine can promote racism. There's persistent belief on the part of medicine that Black people don't feel pain the same way white people did. There's been studies that show over time that, and this has been going on for centuries now, that less pain medication is given to Black patients, that their descriptions of the pain they're experiencing are taken less seriously. So there's a real, there can be real failures of people working in the medical field to recognize their own implicit bias and the way that that bias might be affecting, the treatment that they're giving. But there's also, sort of a general view of science as universal that can also kind of get in the way of thinking about particular patients and communities and needs that we need to kind of take account of.
Thank you. Caleb wants to know, when viewing race as a technology, how do you think racial categories will change as our world becomes an increasingly global community?
That's really interesting. Again, I think, as with the similar question, there are changes and there's like a sort of frustrating resilience of the old categories as well. If you think about the U.S. and sort of the way that we think about racial groups in the U.S., we actually group together people who are very distant in sort of time and place, right? So you can be Black or Asian, or Latinx in the U.S., and you can be from so many different places, having come to the U.S. at so many different times, right? And still we have this sort of grouping together and this sort of pseudo-biological understanding of what those groups are, right? So, for Latinx communities, right, you have a whole bunch of different people, people who were, have been in the U.S. since it annexed parts of Mexico, and people who have come from, South America, people who've come from Latin America, people who've come from the Caribbean. Yeah, I mean, you can have a lot of different groups. And similarly with Black people, you can have people from Africa recently, from the Caribbean recently, people whose ancestors were slaves, so originating from West Africa, but obviously engaged in a lot of racial mixing. There's a great deal of racial mixing in the U.S. in its history. So there's all these sorts of mixings and histories and diverse origins, but when you get to the U.S., right, people start to think of you in terms of these categories, which they also think of in a certain way as these sort of biological or genetic categories. Mm-hmm. So, I'm interested in how ideas of race might change and develop. I can't kind of predict it. But I also am aware of the sort of stickiness of the concept of race, of the way that it really can persist even as a lot of material conditions shift and time goes on. So.
Thank you. Aiden wants to know, do you know what percentage of children are born with the aid of art technologies? Is that number going up? Are arts typically too expensive for less well-off couples?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have the exact numbers. It's not, it's grown a lot, but it does not yet make up a huge percentage of children born. So it's increased a great deal, but it still, does not, come anywhere close to sort of other so-called natural reproduction. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the financial disparity is significant. It takes a lot of money to undergo most of these technologies. Sperm donation is the cheapest, but in vitro fertilization is quite expensive. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars per cycle. Not all cycles are successful. In fact, they're typically most people have to do more than one. And that comes to be the same thing with gestational surrogacy. So now you're paying not only for the cycles of IVF, but also paying the surrogate for her gestational labor. So that then you're looking at an attempt at gestational surrogacy in the U.S. $40,000, $50,000. Most people, don't have that out of pocket. So it's sort of like buying a house or any other kind of major expense, or a car, right? We're talking about, borrowing money, financing, that kind of thing. So it becomes accessible by the level of people's desire to have a child to sort of middle-class people who can leverage credit. But it remains inaccessible to people who don't have access to that kind of credit, especially in the U.S. In some other countries, some other Western countries, there is, government health systems do cover some forms of reproductive technologies, so that can be more available in those places. But then there are, places, poorer countries where, the facilities for this kind of thing are not available at all, and it would only be the very, very wealthy in those countries who would then travel to a place like the U.S. to actually use the medical services.
Thank you. Olivia wants to know, how would you approach having a political conversation with people who have opposing views on today's racial issues? That's a loaded question. It has turned into a very left or right argument, but I just want to understand where everyone is coming from without political labeling.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. Mm-hmm. We are in an increasingly, a really politicized time. We're in a time when politics determines whether you think you want to wear a mask, which I did wear coming to the studio, by the way, just so everyone knows. But yeah, so it has become so difficult in many ways to talk across a sort of left-right political divide. Yeah, I don't think there is a non-political way to do it. I think we sort of fool ourselves if we think, oh, okay, well, there's a sort of neutral way that we can talk about these things. So I think it really, it comes down to a willingness to speak to people who are not in our sort of political silos, and to speak respectfully and honestly and to listen. So I think it's down to the willingness, but I don't think we should think that there are non-political ways to approach these things. It's my view of race as technology in part really seeks to emphasize the political usefulness of race and why how the use of race has been has become so prevalent because of political issues and because of political aims, right? That's certainly was the case in Nazi Germany, right? To make an enemy of Jewish people was a tactic on the part of Hitler to gain power, right? So I don't think we can ever separate race and politics, but we certainly can and should try to converse across political lines by listening carefully and speaking respectfully and marshaling whatever evidence we can. I mean, here at the university, we just sort of have to believe in evidence and research and the value of that to illuminate things. So, that's what we believe in, and we can try our best. But it doesn't mean that people's commitments, their psychological commitments, their family commitments, other things might not prevent them from hearing information.
Yeah, thank you. The last question I want to ask is actually about philosophy as a discipline, and I think a lot of times philosophy is one of those disciplines, a major that people wonder, especially young people, or when they're thinking about careers in their future, they often think of a major and how it applies, and sometimes someone say, well, what are you going to do with a philosophy major? And to my mind, the philosophy discipline is one that is foundational to the liberal arts. There's so much there that can be explored, and one where any student can benefit from being a major or a minor, or even just taking a philosophy class. And so one of the questions that came up was, how does taking classes in philosophy help set me up for a different career path? Can you speak a little bit to the way in which philosophy courses or a major or a minor might help a student who wants to do something else with their life?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a whole other slideshow that we also have in the department. But yeah, and so it turns out that in terms of other sort of liberal arts majors, philosophy majors are actually high earners, and not as philosophers themselves, but as critical thinkers, as people who have learned to read well, to describe things well, to explain things well, to understand and work with ideas. And what we know about careers is, these days, is that they're not. It's not the same as, say my parents, or and maybe not even the parent. Maybe the parents. It's already changed for the parents of this generation. Yes. But people change careers a lot these days. And so a lot of the skills that you sort of want to get from a college education have to do with the ability to sort of think and move between different areas of work and bring skills of thinking, writing, communicating to different areas. So philosophy really does, I think, prepare people for that. And we do find that our alumni, they sometimes pair the philosophy major with something else. And so they may, maybe they're doing filmmaking or something like that. We have a particular alum I'm thinking of, and he says, yeah, I make commercials and advertisements, and marketing was part of my major, but the philosophy stuff actually really inflects how I do this and how I do it well. So there is the sort of pairing of it with another discipline to really kind of, again, exercise those thinking and problem-solving skills. But there's also, we have a minor, we have an ethics minor, so we have a philosophy minor just in general, we have an ethics minor, which sort of helps you think through ethical issues, which is something all fields need and desire. You see questions about diversity in hiring as well. We also have a diversity focus, which allows you to kind of take some courses in philosophy that focus on diversity and receive a sort of notation about that. So we have a lot of different ways of allowing people to get involved with the department, down to philosophy club and stuff like that, which you don't have to be a major to join. But it's clear, I think the data really supports actually that that work in philosophy really does help prepare you for the kinds of problem-solving skills, the thinking skills, the communication skills, the reading skills that you need to move through a series of careers as people do these days. It's also, of course, great for law school. Nothing better for getting your good LSAT scores.
That's awesome. Okay, well, that's all the time that we have today. I do want to mention that it was clear in the Q&A that so many of our students who are watching you today want to be in your classes, and so I would expect that your classes will be quite full this upcoming year. So thank you for that, and to you students who are watching, thank you so much for joining us and all your wonderful questions. If you have questions about this or any other introduction program, please visit our website at orientation.uoregon.edu, email us at orientation@uoregon.edu, or text us at 541-346-1159. If you submitted a question to our presenter and we didn't answer it live, we will ensure that we follow up with you early next week. Thank you so much, Dr. Russell. It was a pleasure hearing you and your perspective today, and I appreciate all your time for our new ducks this morning.
Thank you.